I'd like to, from this, go on to something that brings the whole thing closer to our own life and have us consider where, indeed, in our practice we have been informed by the mentality that the image of perfection is so desirable that we color it, we write it out in great detail, we map it out in our minds, and then seek to fulfill it in our life in such a way that the cost it might involve on others and ourselves is of no consideration. That is, that we have an image of perfection which we impose on situations in which then there is no room for the untidy, the imperfection, the less than desirable, the, as I said, untidy of human existence. There are, among other things, the things that the Isaacs have written about in a wonderful book that I've referred to, the coercive utopians, the desire to simplify life, to be closer to nature. It is Schumacher's book, Small is Beautiful, telling us that we should learn to make do without electricity, to go back to nature, to go green, in fact. It has a long history. It's not only of our own generation. It goes back to people like Malthus, who wrote that nature will always limit the number of people living on Earth because there won't be enough food. He said that to almost 200 years ago, and we're still around and have far more people around because of various ways in which indeed we've fulfilled the mandate Scripture gave us to know how things work and to do such things as efficient irrigation systems, the way the Israelis developed them, or the Green Revolution, or the development of synthetic medicine, so you don't have to eat a whole hay cart full of herbs in order to feel better. But the idea of nature being better than civilization, that chemistry is the great evil, fails to understand that God, of course, created a natural world that is full of chemistry. There is no tree that does not go through a chemical process in order to grow leaves in the spring and fruit in the summer. But the idea to turn against civilization, against industry, smokestacks and so forth, as I said, has a long history. Malthus complained about growing birth rates through the 19th century, which were brought about by better food, by more jobs, and by personal hygiene, as well as a few other factors. And thus it was possible to disprove Malthus's prediction. But you also have William Blake, you have Rousseau in their reaction to civilization, to industry. Blake writes poems against smokestacks in Britain in the growing industrialization. You had the anti-technology movement in the 19th century, which contributed, by the way, in parentheses, to the anti-Semitism, because the Jew was associated with capital, with factories, with investment, with money management, and thus he was considered to be part of the evil. And anti-Semitism in the 19th century also drew strength from that notion that the Jew stands against nature, against the romantic, against life on the farm. You as a state view for natural man versus civilized man, in perspective, in pursuit of an end state rather than what the Christian and the Jew is interested in, being motivated for the improvement of the human condition, no matter what state. The coercive utopians are those today who wish us to go back to some state in the past when we had no internal combustion engine, failing to recognize that if in fact we had as many people in the United States now as back then in the industrial state of the 1850s, we'd have to use 2/3 of the arable land to grow food for the horses that draw the carriages and so forth. Look at the messy streets of London in the 1880s, the human and animal waste, the smoke, the smog, etc., etc. A return to prior ages, as some of the politically oriented green movements advocate, is another ideology which, once imposed, would require, in fact, tremendous sacrifices on great numbers of people who would not be able to live, to be nourished, etc. It is an idea, pretty pictures, that doesn't correspond to reality. It is indeed expressing a frustration with problems that industrialization has caused. failing, however, to see that at every stage, the human being, once informed by Judaism and Christianity, has not only been a problem, but he's also been a solution. And that every solution automatically in a fallen world brings additional problems for which only Judaism and Christianity has encouraged us to look for further solutions. When I used to teach in Russia, I used to point out how, yes, industrialization, capitalism, etc., has produced much smog and industry and dirt and problems and noise and other things, but it also created hundreds of thousands of jobs. It has pushed us to develop new technologies, to find ways to diminish the problems. And we have been rather successful, admirably successful, not in any perfect sense, but that the human being isn't the central problem. Industry is not the central problem. It is, the central problem is that is in front of us and we need to deal with it. But there are only two ways to deal with it, and either is to take the bull by the horn and find ways to diminish the problem, or to get rid of the person who could take the bull by the horn, which has been the practice under Stalinism and Pol Potism and the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution in China, that is, get rid of human beings. And insofar as some of the Greens advocate a return to the 19th century or even the 12th century, apart from historical ignorance, what it would mean is that they should sacrifice themselves as the first to go off the scene, and of course nobody is willing to do that. It's quite understandable. But utopian mentality is closer to home. There is indeed also this systemic utopia, I've called it here on my piece of paper, and that is the belief that indeed America is an exceptional nation of exceptional people, that it's the best system, most beloved, most efficient and admired around the world. That mentality is utopian in the sense that it closes a person or a people off to the dynamic engagement with one's own insufficiency, with one's own failure. It's a statement of self-satisfaction, as if in fact one had arrived. When, in my experience, I constantly need to review the glory of my own situation in light of the fact that I have 5 children who around the dinner table are quite ready to critique what I say or what I do. That kind of criticism advances. It does not retard. It is not insulting. It's rather encouraging. It pushes you along to prove, to check up, to examine what one believes. In the present discussion, or last year's discussion about healthcare, it was always lamentable how easily people stood up and said that we have the best healthcare system in the world. That's not true, according to the statistics, where the infant mortality rate in this country is just above that of Turkey and Mexico, where, in fact, the best healthcare is available to those who get to it, but not available as such. Where in education, we don't have the best education, except in graduate school, but not in undergraduate or high school. We don't have that, and we need to examine that. It's ideological to assume that we are the best, exceptional, most efficient, and most admired. We need the transformation, the critical politics, the dynamic, open reality that the Bible talks about, of the mandates for Adam and Eve to explore ways to improve, to stay away from what is damaged, to avoid sin and evil. We must at all times see ourselves as precisely unfinished, untidy, and not ideologically anchor ourselves in a belief that has nothing to do with the facts on the ground. We need to resist closure. And closure is embraced when I assume that I have arrived at the best, at the top. That easily smacks of an unfounded arrogance because it's not rooted in the facts on the ground. So when the Republicans on the right say that people should be free from all governmental control because they know best, you know, when there the party says the American people have spoken and fail to see that half the American people have spoken otherwise, it's a statement of arrogance of the real situation. It's assuming an ideological perfection. When the Democrats assume that everything can be solved by more money and taxation, it is the same kind of a problem, though by different means. And neither of them is willing to actually deal with the problem on the ground, and that is, how do children learn? What need they to be given? What context need they to be given? What social problems have we created that so many children grow up without their parents, without conversation with their parents, that their brains are being increasingly underdeveloped because nobody ever talks to them? What is so essential in the development of a child, the first few years of a child's brain are physically informed by whether it receives conversation or images. When a child receives conversation, it involves logical sequence, subject, verb, object, dependent clause, personal pronouns, and such, need to be figured out, and the brain develops differently and enables the child better to think rationally, sequentially. While a child that is informed by image has sensual perceptions of momentary surprise, but no comprehension of what is seen. And that's not theory, that's what you can read about in wonderful books by Jane Healy, who works up here at the Einstein Institute, Albert Einstein School of Medicine, part of Yeshiva University, in a book called Endangered Minds, which extends Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death book into the technical, medical observation of the developing infant's brain.